In the winter of 1942, 96,000 German troops were encircled near the town of Demyansk, frozen, starving, and surrounded by 7 Soviet armies. Temperatures plunged to 40 below, ammunition ran out, and every field became a graveyard. Yet even then, Hitler's order was clear. No retreat, no surrender. Inside the pocket fought some of the most battle-hardened units on the Eastern Front, the Waffen-SS Totenkopf Division and the Danish volunteers of Frikorps Danmark. What followed was a brutal siege that tested the limits of human endurance, where survival itself became an act of defiance. At first glance, it may seem strange that men from conquered nations would willingly take up arms for the very power that had occupied them. Yet across Scandinavia in the early 1940s, that is precisely what happened. Before the German invasion of Denmark and Norway, only a handful of Scandinavians had served in the German armed forces. But after the Wehrmacht swept into both countries in April 1940, 2 years before the battles in the Demyansk Pocket, Waffen-SS recruiting offices opened in Copenhagen and Oslo. This initiative came directly from Heinrich Himmler himself. His vision was to form an elite SS division composed of volunteers from Northern Europe, men he described as Germanic brothers. A multinational unit built from 4 core elements: 1 regiment of Germans, 1 of Dutch volunteers known as Westland, a Scandinavian regiment called Nordland, and a Finnish battalion. In practice, however, the recruitment drive fell short. Only around 3,000 men from across Scandinavia, including Finland, answered the call. For Himmler's grand vision, it was a disappointment. Undeterred, the Germans renewed their efforts in 1941, as the war against the Soviet Union began. They hoped the brutal conflict between the USSR and Finland would ignite a sense of shared cause among Northern Europeans. This time, the recruits were organized into national legions: Frikorps Danmark for the Danes and the Norwegian Legion for volunteers from Norway. The ideological motivation shifted. Early skepticism toward National Socialism gave way to a powerful wave of anti-communism. Across Europe, the German propaganda machine framed the war in the East as a holy crusade, a struggle to defend Western civilization from Bolshevism. For many right-wing nationalists in Scandinavia, this message resonated deeply. As the years dragged on and the casualty lists on the Eastern Front grew longer, the Waffen-SS lowered its physical and racial standards. What mattered now was willpower, not pedigree. By this stage, the Waffen-SS had transformed into a vast multinational force, an army within an army. Danes, Norwegians, Finns, Dutch, Flemish, and many others found themselves serving beneath its black flags. To the German command, recruiting foreigners was more than ideological theatre. It was necessity. The Wehrmacht still monopolized manpower inside Germany, forcing the SS to look outward for strength. From that pragmatic need was born one of the most unlikely phenomena of the entire war: men from across Northern Europe fighting and dying for Hitler's Reich in the frozen wastes of the Eastern Front. Before 1940, only a handful of Scandinavian volunteers had taken up arms for Germany, but after the swift invasions of Norway and Denmark in the spring of 1940, their numbers grew sharply. The ranks of the Waffen-SS soon contained a notable northern presence, mainly Norwegians and Danes, along with a smaller number of Swedes and a single Finnish battalion. In total, more than 20,000 men from Scandinavia would serve in the Waffen-SS by the war's end: around 13,000 Danes, 7,000 Norwegians, and 2,000 Swedes, 1,000 Norwegians, 1,500 Finns, and several hundred Swedes. Of the 13,000 Danes who applied for German service, only about 7,000 were accepted, most of them into the Waffen-SS itself. To put that in perspective, the entire Danish army before the war numbered barely 6,500 men. The Finns were mostly assigned to the elite SS Division Viking, fighting deep inside the Soviet Union until their withdrawal back to Finland in 1943. The Swedes were scattered across the northern front under Army Group North, often serving as medics, drivers or machine gunners in the brutal conditions around Leningrad. At any one time, roughly 3,000 Scandinavians fought at the front. Despite their limited numbers, their record was distinguished. SS Division Nordland, composed largely of Danes and Norwegians, earned the 5th highest total of Knight's Crosses among all Waffen-SS divisions. Yet, despite this, the Grand Germanic Army envisioned by Himmler never materialized. The numbers were simply too small. Most Danish volunteers served within 3 main formations. The first was Frikorps Danmark, or the Danish Legion. The second was SS Division Viking, and the third, after 1943, when the legions were dissolved, was SS Division Nordland. About 1,500 Danes came from the ethnic German minority in southern Jutland. Many of them gravitated toward SS Division Totenkopf, and some into its notorious 1st SS Brigade, units already hardened by campaigns in Poland and France. The first wave of Danish volunteers entered combat in the summer of 1941, when SS Division Viking joined the invasion of the Soviet Union. Only a few hundred Danes were attached to Viking at a time, and after 2 years of heavy campaigning they were largely absorbed into the newly formed Nordland Division. The majority of Danish recruits, meanwhile, were still completing their training with Frikorps Danmark, while Viking fought its bloody battles across the Ukrainian plains. Frikorps Danmark itself was created on June 25, 1941, just days after Germany launched its assault on the Soviet Union. Within weeks, around 500 volunteers had stepped forward, and by autumn their numbers had doubled. Unusually, this unit was not formed in defiance of Copenhagen, but with its approval. Both the Danish government and the Danish army sanctioned its creation, seeing it as a way for Denmark to prove its loyalty to Berlin. Officers of the Danish army were even granted formal leave to join, and government representatives attended the departure ceremony as the Frikorps marched out of Denmark, flags flying, brass bands playing, and families waving them off to the war in the east. Many believed they were joining a defensive crusade against Bolshevism, not a campaign of conquest. In one Danish volunteer's later words, "We thought it would be a short fight, that we would save Europe from communism and come home as heroes. But the farther we went into Russia, the less the war made sense. The land was endless, and so was the dying." Many of the Scandinavian men who volunteered for service with Germany were not strangers to war. Some were hardened veterans of the Finnish Winter War against the Soviet Union in 1939. Others had previously served in the short-lived armies of Norway and Denmark. Their military experience made them valuable recruits for the Waffen-SS, and Berlin wasted no time in organizing similar legions across occupied Europe, from the Netherlands to Flanders, all under the careful supervision of SS headquarters in Berlin and the local National Socialist parties. This arrangement allowed the Germans to emphasize each legion's national character. Officers were often drawn from the volunteers' own ranks rather than imposed by Berlin, giving these formations a degree of autonomy and a sense of legitimacy back home. It also served a propaganda purpose, to convince ordinary citizens that the men joining the SS were not traitors, but patriots answering a continental call to defend Europe against Bolshevism. In practice, however, most recruits still came from far-right or openly pro-German circles within their countries. Despite the ideological fanfare, the legions were modest in scale and poorly equipped. They were infantry formations without armour, with only light support weapons and meagre artillery. In truth, they were never meant to be decisive on the battlefield. They were symbols of Germanic unity as much as fighting forces. By early 1942, the Norwegian Legion, Den Norske Legion, was dispatched to the front near Oranienbaum and the northern approaches to Leningrad. There, the volunteers found themselves trapped in the static hell of trench warfare. For a year and a half, they endured the mud, the lice, and the constant Soviet shelling, conditions that felt eerily reminiscent of World War I. Casualties mounted, replacements were scarce, and morale began to fray. For the Danes, however, the ordeal was even worse. That same year, units from Frikorps Danmark were ordered into one of the most brutal sectors of the entire Eastern Front, the frozen inferno of the Demyansk salient. Their mission was to reinforce the battle-hardened SS Totenkopf Division, which had been encircled deep inside Soviet territory and was fighting desperately to hold its ground. The struggle for Demyansk has often been reduced to a footnote in broader histories of the Eastern Front, a minor episode overshadowed by Stalingrad. But in the spring and summer of 1942, it was one of the defining battles of the Northern Front, a siege, an airlift, and a test of endurance that would foreshadow the disasters yet to come. Depending on the moment, the German position at Demyansk was described as either a salient, a bulge pushing east from the main defensive line, or, when fully cut off, as a pocket. Both descriptions were accurate. The front shifted constantly, like a wounded animal trying to stay alive. For the Danish volunteers, the battle would prove catastrophic. Though their role was minor in the grand scale of the Eastern Front, the fighting around Demyansk resulted in the single bloodiest loss of Danish lives in the entire war. It was there, amid the forests and frozen marshes of northern Russia, that the dream of a Germanic crusade met the brutal reality of modern war. One Danish survivor would later write, "We came to Russia believing we were part of something larger, a brotherhood of nations. But at Demyansk there were no nations, no flags, only hunger, fear, and the sound of artillery that never stopped." Little has been written in English about these men or their experiences. Their story, like Demyansk itself, has largely been forgotten. What follows is an attempt to bring their ordeal back to light, to show what really happened when the Scandinavian volunteers of the Waffen-SS were thrown into one of the most hopeless battles of the war. The Great Soviet Winter Offensive that erupted in December 1941 was intended to destroy the German threat to Moscow once and for all. The Red Army, having repelled the enemy from the very gates of the capital, believed the tide had turned. General Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center had been halted and driven back. The myth of German invincibility was broken. For the first time since the invasion began, the Wehrmacht was retreating. This success filled Stalin and the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, with a dangerous confidence. Convinced that the Germans were near collapse, they decided to extend the counter-offensive along the entire Eastern Front. From the frozen forests of northern Finland to the Black Sea coast, new attacks were launched in rapid succession. The goals were sweeping: to destroy Army Group Center, lift the siege of Leningrad, and drive the Germans out of the Crimea and the Donbas region. In hindsight, the plan was hopelessly ambitious. The Soviet armies were still recovering from catastrophic losses of 1941. Their supply lines were overstretched, their transport inadequate, and their troops exhausted. The victory before Moscow had been costly, and though the German lines were shaken, they were far from broken. By striking everywhere at once, the Soviets diluted their strength. The offensives soon bogged down in snow, ice, and mud. As the bitter winter dragged into the spring thaw, entire formations became stranded in the slush. For the defenders, the terrain turned into an ally. German units clinging to survival mounted extraordinary defenses despite being ill-equipped for the sub-zero conditions. Their winter clothing was inadequate, their rations scarce, yet discipline and cohesion held. The Red Army paid a devastating price for its overreach. Between January and March 1942, Soviet losses exceeded 620,000 men killed. In the same period, German fatalities numbered roughly 136,000. The ratio hardly changed when total casualties were counted, wounded, captured, and missing alike. Soviet mobility and logistics simply could not sustain offensives of such magnitude. Even Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the architects of the counterattack, later admitted the truth. In his memoirs, he wrote bitterly, "If you consider our losses and what results were achieved, it will be clear that it was a Pyrrhic victory." The strategy of attrition, bleeding the Germans dry through constant assaults, failed. Instead, the Red Army exhausted itself. For all the human cost, the front lines shifted only slightly. The Germans, battered but intact, held their positions through the thaw and prepared for the next move. As the ice melted and the ground turned to mud, both sides paused to recover. The Soviets were forced to rebuild their shattered divisions, convinced that the next German blow would again fall toward Moscow. But the Wehrmacht's high command had other plans. When the next offensive came, it would not strike at the center, but at the south. And by then, the Soviet armies, drained by the overextended winter push, were in no condition to resist. Across the northern sector of the Eastern Front, the situation in early 1942 teetered on the edge of catastrophe. On both sides of the boundary between Army Group Center and North, Soviet offensives had torn deep wedges into the German front. At one point, it even appeared that the Red Army might succeed in encircling both the 9th Army and the 3rd Panzer Army, a disaster that could have opened the road to the Baltic. This calamity was narrowly avoided. After Field Marshal Fedor von Bock was relieved of command, his replacement, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, managed to stabilize the situation. Through ruthless counterattacks and careful withdrawals, his divisions clawed back ground and prevented a total collapse. Still, the front was dangerously overstretched, and every mile held came at a staggering cost. Through ruthless counterattacks and careful withdrawals, his divisions clawed back ground and prevented a total collapse. Still, the front was dangerously overstretched, and every mile held came at a staggering cost. Further north, the Soviet spearheads had carved out a massive bulge in the German line, a protrusion that stretched around the town of Toropets and pushed deep into the boundary between the two army groups. The northern edge of this bulge reached into the sector of Army Group North, forming a deadly salient between the towns of Cholm in the southwest and Demyansk, a small city roughly 100 miles south of Leningrad in the northeast. Here the German front resembled a vast, brittle arc straining under pressure. On paper, Army Group North still appeared strong. It was commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, one of the Wehrmacht's most respected veterans. Under his authority stood two major forces: General Georg von Küchler's 18th Army, positioned north around Leningrad, and General Ernst Busch's 16th Army, which defended the southern flank between Lake Ilmen and the town of Cholm. The Red Army's aim was nothing less than the destruction of Küchler's and Busch's forces through encirclement. As the blizzards swept across the forests and lakes of northern Russia, the fighting became a frozen nightmare. German supply columns vanished in the snow. Communication lines collapsed. Soviet ski battalions slipped through the woods and struck from the flanks. In February, the storm gathered around a name that would soon become infamous among the men of the Waffen-SS and the Wehrmacht alike: Demyansk, a quiet town surrounded by forest and marshland, about to become the center of one of the most desperate battles of the entire war. Despite recognizing the danger posed by the Soviet bulge around Toropets, the Germans could do little to exploit it. By early 1942, their armies were spent. The drive on Moscow the previous autumn, followed by the relentless Soviet counteroffensive, had drained the life out of Army Group Center and North. Entire divisions existed on paper only. Replacements were scarce, reinforcements arrived too late, and the weather consumed what the enemy had not. General Gotthard Heinrizi, commander of the 9th Army, gave a stark account of the situation. His battalions, once several hundred men strong, were reduced to barely 70 soldiers apiece, supported by no more than 7 functioning machine guns. Many companies were commanded by non-commissioned officers, as most of their officers had been killed or wounded. What remained of the German front was a patchwork of understrength formations, held together by discipline and habit. Against this backdrop, the Demyansk salient emerged as one of the most fiercely contested points on the entire Eastern Front. Both sides understood its importance. To the Soviets, it was a dagger that had to be snapped off. To the Germans, it was the last bastion preventing a complete collapse of the Northern Front. The defense of this exposed position fell to the Second Corps of the 16th Army under Lieutenant General Walter Graf Brockdorff Ahlenfeld. He was 54 years old, an aristocrat of the old Prussian school who had joined the army in 1907 and made his name as a corps commander during the campaign in France. Now, in the frozen wilderness of northern Russia, he faced a challenge that no textbook could prepare him for. His corps consisted of 3 battered infantry divisions, the 12th from Mecklenburg, the 32nd from Pomerania and East Prussia, and the 123rd from Brandenburg. All 3 had fought since the opening of Operation Barbarossa and were shadows of their former strength. Their companies were thin, their artillery short of shells, and their horses dying from exhaustion. Worse still, the men were fighting the Russian winter in summer uniforms. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Metal froze to bare skin. Lubricants turned solid in weapon chambers. The soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, curtains, and whatever rags they could find. In the rear areas, clerks and drivers sent forward their spare clothing to the front, but they too were poorly equipped, dressed in thin wool tunics more suited to France than to Russia. The Soviets meanwhile prepared their next move. The Northwestern Front, commanded by Lieutenant General Pavel Kurochkin, was tasked with encircling the entire northern flank of the German 16th Army. His orders were clear: to strike from both north and south, link up east of Demyansk, and cut off the entire German salient. To accomplish this, the Stavka committed massive forces. 3 armies were designated for the northern strike: the 11th Army under Lieutenant General Morozov, advancing from the Lake Ilmen area, the 34th Army under Major General Nikolai Bersarin, pushing from the Valdai Hills, and the elite 1st Shock Army, composed of well-equipped and politically reliable units, brought forward to deliver the decisive blow. What was about to unfold was not a single battle, but a siege. A slow, freezing strangulation fought across the snow-choked forests and frozen rivers of northwestern Russia. "We no longer fought for victory," recalled one German infantryman of the 12th Division. "We fought to stay warm, to find food, to keep the man next to us alive until morning." The cold was the real enemy. The Russians only finished what it started. In the weeks that followed, the Demyansk salient, once seen by the German High Command as a potential springboard for future offensives, would become a trap. Inside it were the remnants of 6 divisions, including the men of Frikorps Danmark and the SS Totenkopf Division. They would soon find themselves surrounded, cut off from the outside world, and forced to survive in conditions that defied imagination. The Soviet plan to destroy the Demyansk salient unfolded in full force in early January 1942. While the northern strike hammered at Lake Ilmen and the Valdai Hills, the southern drive was spearheaded by 3 armies: the 53rd under Major General Alexander Xenofontov, the 22nd under Lieutenant General V. Ayashkevich, and the 3rd Shock Army. Together they were tasked with breaking through toward the town of Kolm and closing the southern arm of the encirclement around Demyansk. Behind them, Soviet partisans rose up in the forests and swamps of the German rear, cutting roads, ambushing convoys, and strangling the already thin supply lines, particularly around Staraya Russa. The offensive began on January 7th. The 11th Soviet Army, reinforced by elements of the 1st Shock Army and 2 elite Guards Rifle Corps from Stavka's strategic reserve, smashed into the northern front of the German line. 2 days later, further south, the 3rd Shock Army, joined by the 53rd and 22nd Armies, surged westward toward Kolm and Lake Seliger, striking precisely at the seam between Army Group Center and Army Group North. If this breakthrough succeeded, it would drive deep behind the German lines and sever both army groups from one another. On the left flank of 2nd Corps, General Christian Hansen's 10th Corps struggled to hold under the onslaught. Like Brockdorff-Ahlenfeldt's command, Hansen's corps consisted of 3 divisions: the 30th Infantry Division from Schleswig-Holstein under General Kurt von Tippelskirch, the 291st Infantry Division from Hanover and Schleswig-Holstein under General Theodor Freiherr von Wrede, and the 3rd SS Totenkopf Division, commanded by the ruthless SS Obergruppenführer Theodor Eicke, the man who had once overseen all concentration camp guards in Germany. During the night of January 7th to 8th, Soviet infantry and tank formations slipped through the snow-covered forests between the strong points of the 291st and 31st Divisions. At dawn, German outposts awoke to find entire Soviet battalions already in their rear. To the Germans' shock, Soviet transport gliders began landing directly on the frozen surface of Lake Ilmen, disgorging men and light tanks that rolled off the ice and pushed toward the junction of the Lovati, Redia and Polisti rivers, 25 miles behind the 291st Division. 19 Soviet infantry divisions, 9 brigades, and a swarm of independent ski and tank battalions were now hammering both X and 2 Corps. The 11th Army's main blow fell upon the 291st near the village of Tutilovo. The fighting was savage, bayonets and grenades at close quarters. The German left was overrun, the right flank held for another day before collapsing. The 290th fought its way west through a patchwork of villages, each one defended to the last man. Behind them, the 1st and 2nd Guards Corps plunged south, striking at Pafino and Salueje. Soviet ski troops were already approaching Staraya Russa. In desperation, the Germans threw together an improvised line from clerks, mechanics and military police, while a single regiment of the 18th Motorized Division was rushed in from Simsk to plug the gap. It was too late. By January 25th, the 291st Infantry Division was surrounded and could only be supplied by air. Between January 8th and February 13th, the division fought off 146 separate Soviet assaults before finally clawing its way back toward friendly lines, its strength reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Further south, the front of 2nd Corps was also crumbling. On January 9th, after a 2-hour artillery barrage, 6 Soviet rifle divisions, supported by tanks and ski battalions, smashed into the junction between the 123rd Division and its neighbours. 2 regiments of the 123rd were virtually annihilated, leaving a 60-mile gap through which the Red Army poured. The 34th Soviet Army pressed from the east, reinforced by 2 airborne brigades, while General Brockdorff-Ahlenfeld begged for permission to withdraw the easternmost part of his front. By mid-January, the once stable German line resembled a patchwork of collapsing strongpoints. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, commanding Army Group North, realized the scale of the disaster. On January 12th, he called Führer headquarters and requested permission to pull back behind the Lovati River. Hitler refused outright. Lieb flew personally to East Prussia to plead his case face to face. Once again, the answer was no. Demyansk, Hitler insisted, must be held to the last man. Furious, Lieb requested to be relieved of command, and Hitler accepted. His replacement, General Georg von Küchler, took over Army Group North. General Georg Lindemann assumed command of the 18th Army. By this point, the southern front of the 16th Army had ceased to exist. The 123rd Infantry Division, shattered, defended isolated villages around Molvoticin. 2 of its regiments, the 415th and 416th, fought their way back through Soviet lines, arriving days later with only 900 survivors combined. The remnants of the 32nd and 123rd Divisions managed to build a thin makeshift defensive line more than 100 miles long, manned by barely 12,000 men. The only factor preventing a complete Soviet breakthrough was the tenacity of German strongpoints, platoon-sized pockets of men in frozen villages who refused to surrender. Some were overrun, others held out for weeks, forcing the Red Army to divert whole battalions to eliminate them. That stubborn resistance bought time, but at a terrible cost. By late January, the Demyansk salient was buckling. Fresh Soviet divisions were pouring through the 60-mile gap to the south, threatening to cut off the salient entirely. Brockdorff-Ahlenfeld's headquarters sent a message to the 16th Army. They would withdraw behind the Lovati River as soon as possible. The reply from the German High Command was terse: Demyansk is to be defended to the last man. In response, Brockdorf-Ahlenfeld withdrew the units under SS Obergruppenführer Eicke from the eastern sector and rushed them west to form a blocking line near Salueje. They arrived just in time. On February 8th, Soviet forces of the 34th Army and the 1st Guards Corps met near Rambushevo on the Levati River. The German salient was cut off. Demyansk had become a pocket, a vast isolated trap containing around 100,000 men. To the southwest, the town of Kolm also fell under siege. On January 23rd, it was surrounded by the 3rd Shock Army. 5,000 men under Major General Theodor Scherer of the 281st Security Division hastily fortified the town and declared it a fortress. They fought in temperatures that plunged to -46 degrees, with little food or ammunition, supplied only by air. The battle for Kolm became a grim miniature of what was now unfolding on a far larger scale at Demyansk. Inside the pocket, 6 divisions prepared for the ordeal ahead. To the east and south of Demyansk stood the 12th Mecklenburg and 32nd Pomeranian divisions. In the southwest, the remnants of the 123rd held their ground. North of Demyansk fought the 30th and 291st Divisions, while to the northeast stood elements of the SS Totenkopf Division under Colonel Max Simon. In the west, Eicke's Totenkopf battle groups dug in to face the Soviet assault head-on. The encircled area spanned more than 1,800 square miles. The defensive front stretched for nearly 190 miles, across frozen lakes, forests and villages. Inside were 100,000 men, cut off, surrounded, and about to endure one of the most harrowing sieges of the entire war. "We could hear the Soviets shouting across the snow," wrote a Danish volunteer from Frikorps Danmark. "They promised us food if we came over." Some men thought about it. Most just stared at the trees and waited for the next bombardment. The Demyansk salient had become the Demyansk Pocket, and for the men trapped inside, there would be no relief from the cold, the hunger, or the encirclement for months to come. When the encirclement was complete, General Walter Graf Brockdorf-Ahlenfeld gathered his commanders and issued his first order of the day. His message was defiant. "There are 96,000 of us. The German soldier is superior to the Russian. This has been proven. So, let the difficult times come. We are ready." Inside the pocket, morale held firm. The men still believed in relief, in the promise of German air power, and in the conviction that no encircled force of the Reich would ever be abandoned. Unlike the smaller encirclement at Sukhinichi a month earlier, Adolf Hitler refused to withdraw or sacrifice either Kolm or Demyansk. The Luftwaffe's high command assured him that the reinforced 1st Air Fleet could sustain both pockets by air, delivering between 240 and 265 tons of supplies each day. On that assurance, Hitler issued a simple, absolute order. The pockets would be defended until relieved. There would be no retreat. On February 18th, the German High Command transferred almost the entire air transport command from the Smolensk region to support Luftwaffe 1's operations over Demyansk. Nearly every available Junkers 52 transport aircraft was redirected north, supported by converted bombers pressed into cargo service. The effort consumed virtually the entire transport capacity of the Luftwaffe. Demyansk and the nearby airfield at Peski offered the besieged troops one advantage: 2 frozen runways, still usable for takeoffs and landings. This allowed both supply drops and direct landings of gliders and transports. Pilots flew through driving snow and sleet, often at treetop height, guided only by bonfires marking the airstrips. By mid-February, the weather briefly improved, though deep snow still blanketed the forests. The airlift began to function with remarkable efficiency, aided by the weakness of the Soviet Air Force in the region. Over the following year, until the final evacuation in March 1943, the Luftwaffe would fly more than 33,000 sorties to and from the pocket. Across Demyansk and Kolm, a total of 59,000 tons of supplies were delivered by air and ground convoys. 31,000 replacement troops were flown in, while 36,000 wounded were evacuated. The cost, however, was heavy. The Luftwaffe lost 265 aircraft and, far more damaging, 387 experienced aircrew. The Soviet Air Force, for its part, reportedly lost over 400 aircraft in the same period. Some historians have mistakenly described Demyansk as the first air bridge in military history. In reality, the first major airlift had taken place 2 years earlier during the German invasion of Norway, when 582 aircraft flew over 13,000 sorties to deliver nearly 30,000 troops and more than 2,000 tons of supplies. Yet Demyansk was the first sustained air supply operation conducted under encirclement, a fact that would leave a deep impression on Hitler and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The apparent success of the Demyansk and Kolm operations convinced them that air power alone could sustain large forces cut off on the Eastern Front. When, later that year, the Sixth Army found itself encircled at Stalingrad, Göring proposed the same solution: supply the pocket from the air. Hitler accepted, believing that what had worked at Demyansk could work again. But the two situations were vastly different. Demyansk had contained roughly 1 corps, 6 understrength divisions, requiring around 265 tons of supplies daily. Stalingrad held an entire army, demanding more than 800 tons a day, delivered over far greater distances, and through a Soviet air force now vastly improved. By the winter of 1942 to 1943, the Luftwaffe's transport units were already worn thin from a year of constant losses. Fuel shortages, worn aircraft, and a lack of maintenance bases meant the scale of the Demyansk operation could never be repeated. What had been a limited logistical success in 1942 became, at Stalingrad, a catastrophic delusion. "In Demyansk, we learned how to survive," one Luftwaffe pilot later reflected. "In Stalingrad, we learned that survival was not enough." The Demyansk airlift was a technical triumph, but a strategic poison. It saved 96,000 men from annihilation, yet it taught Hitler all the wrong lessons. After Hitler's flat refusal to allow a withdrawal behind the Levarti River, Field Marshal Ernst Busch's 16th Army began planning a relief attack to break into the Demyansk Pocket from the west. A special formation, Group Seydlitz-Kurzbach, was organized under General Walter Kurt von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of the 12th Infantry Division. It was the same Seydlitz who, months later, would be captured at Stalingrad and become a key figure in the Soviet-backed anti-Nazi officers' movement. Seydlitz's group was formidable on paper: 2 infantry divisions, 2 light divisions, a motorized division, a panzer regiment, a Luftwaffe field regiment, and numerous assault gun, anti-aircraft and construction battalions. The plan was to strike eastward toward the Levarti River, while the encircled forces inside Demyansk attacked westward. The 2 spearheads would meet near the village of Rambushevo and reopen the land bridge to the trapped divisions. On April 21, 1942, after weeks of attritional fighting, the spearheads met, almost. The forward elements of the SS Totenkopf Division reached the west bank of the Levarti, while the lead units of Seydlitz's relief force appeared on the opposite bank. Between them raged a 1,000-foot-wide torrent of ice and floodwater, swollen by the spring thaw. The men could see each other across the river, close enough to shout, but they could not cross. For days, German engineers struggled to throw bridges across the freezing current under constant Soviet fire. When the first bridgehead was finally established, the link was made. A narrow, fragile corridor now connected the 16th Army's front around Staraya Russa and Kolm with the Demyansk Pocket. After nearly 3 months of isolation, the pocket had become a salient once again, yet the connection was tenuous. The Rambushevo corridor was little more than a thin line, less than 2 miles wide in some sectors, and it was constantly under Soviet attack. The Germans fought desperately to hold the flanks open in waist-deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. 3,300 men were killed and more than 10,000 wounded just to keep that sliver of ground open. The Soviets, unwilling to accept this reversal, launched furious counterattacks to sever the corridor and re-isolate the German forces. The task of holding the line fell largely to SS Obergruppenführer Theodor Eicke and his battle-hardened Totenkopf Division. The fighting along the corridor was relentless. Entire battalions melted away under artillery and mortar fire. Eicke demanded reinforcements from the 16th Army and Army Group North, but none could be spared. At the urging of the German High Command, reinforcements were finally found, not from Germany, but from occupied Denmark. Frikorps Danmark, the Danish volunteer corps, was ordered into the Demyansk salient. At the time, the unit was training near Posen-Treschow under its charismatic commander Christian Frederick von Schalburg, a Danish nobleman of Russian descent who had served in the Finnish Winter War. The Frikorps had been plagued by political infighting and poor discipline during its formation, but Schalburg had turned it into a capable, well-drilled battalion. 10 German officers with frontline experience had been assigned to stiffen the command structure, though most officers and NCOs remained Scandinavian. The Frikorps consisted of 3 infantry companies and 1 heavy weapons company. The latter fielded 2 platoons of 75mm infantry guns, 1 platoon of 50mm anti-tank guns, and a combat engineer section. It was well trained but lightly equipped, only 7 heavy caliber weapons for the entire battalion. Many of the men had never seen combat. Others had fought the Soviets before in Finland or with the Viking Division. By May 1942, Frikorps Danmark was declared combat ready. Few in the unit could have imagined that their first deployment would be into one of the bloodiest battlefields of the Eastern Front. On May 8th, around 1,200 Danes were flown from Königsberg to the airstrips inside the Demyansk salient. Upon arrival, they were attached to Eicke's SS Totenkopf Division and immediately thrown into the line along the Robya River near the hamlet of Sutoki. Their mission was to prevent the Soviets from expanding a dangerous bridgehead across the river. Soviet infantry had already crossed to the German side, establishing a foothold. If they could ferry tanks across, the entire Rambushevo corridor would be threatened. Schalburg understood the stakes. The bridgehead had to be destroyed. He selected one of his best officers, Johannes Just Nielsen, a veteran of the Winter War, to lead the attack. On the night of May 27th, Nielsen divided his men into 2 assault groups and crept toward the Soviet lines in silence. They advanced through the marshy terrain until they were almost on top of the Russian trenches. Then, Nielsen pulled the pin on a grenade and hurled it. The explosion was the signal. The Danes charged. The suddenness of the assault threw the Soviets into confusion. Bayonets and submachine guns tore through the snow-covered trenches. Within minutes, the defenders broke, many jumping into the river to escape. But victory came at a price. Soviet mortars and artillery opened up from the far bank. A single barrage struck Nielsen's position. He was killed instantly, his body lost to the river. Instead of holding the captured ground, the Danes withdrew to their original positions, a tactical mistake that would soon cost them dearly. A few days later, the Soviets counterattacked and re-established their bridgehead. Schalburg ordered a new assault for June 2nd. This time, the element of surprise was gone. As the Danes assembled, Soviet artillery rained down on their forming up areas. Schalburg, unwilling to send his men forward alone, went to the front to encourage them personally. As he stepped onto a mined path, an explosion shattered his leg. His men tried to carry him back, but another Soviet barrage struck the group directly. Schalburg and his rescuers were killed instantly. Amid the chaos, a veteran named Alfred Jonstrup, another Finnish war survivor, braved the shellfire to recover his commander's body. The Danes continued the attack, but it stalled under the ferocity of Soviet fire. 21 men were killed and 58 wounded. The Soviets held the bridgehead. Schalburg's body was flown back to Denmark, where he received a state funeral with full military honours. His death transformed him into a martyr for Danish National Socialists, inspiring a new wave of recruits for the Frikorps, men who would soon be needed to replace the heavy losses sustained in Demyansk. Command passed temporarily to Schalburg's comrade from Finland, SS Obersturmbannführer Knut Berger Martinsen, who stabilized the front while awaiting a new commander. Within a week, the Germans appointed Hans Albert von Lettow-Vorbeck, a Prussian aristocrat from SS Division Viking, to take over the Frikorps. In the early summer of 1942, parts of the SS Totenkopf Division began preparing a new operation designed to strengthen the German positions along the western rim of the Demyansk salient. The plan, codenamed Dannebrog, after the Danish flag, aimed to push the front east to the Polar River and establish a defensible line before the next Soviet offensive struck. The newly arrived Frikorps Danmark was assigned a crucial role, the capture of the village of Bolshoye Dubovitsy. On June 10th, the unit's new commander, SS Hauptsturmführer Hans Albert von Lettow-Vorbeck, formerly of SS Division Viking, arrived and was briefed on the coming attack. At dawn the next morning, Danish infantry advanced through flooded meadows and swampland under covering artillery fire. It was an ordeal before the first shot was even fired. The men waded waist deep through icy water and mud, dragging their machine guns on makeshift sleds. When they finally reached the edge of Dubovitsy, Soviet fire tore into them from every house and cellar. Street by street fighting erupted as the Danes cleared the town with grenades and bayonets. Then, without warning, a massive Soviet counterattack swept in from the flanks. Two of the Frikorps company commanders, Boyd Hansen and Alfred Nielsen, were killed in the close-quarter fighting. By mid-morning, the first company, led by former Danish army officer Per Sørensen, was nearly surrounded. Lettow-Vorbeck rushed to the front to order a withdrawal, but was struck down by a burst of Soviet machine gun fire. Losing its second commander in barely a week shattered the Frikorps' cohesion. The Danish assault collapsed and Dubovitsy remained in Soviet hands. 25 Danes were killed in the failed attack, adding to more than 100 killed or wounded in earlier fighting along the Polar River and at Sutoki. Command again passed to SS Obersturmbannführer Knud Berger Martinsen. This time, Berlin chose not to replace him. Martinsen would lead the Frikorps for the rest of its existence. He survived the war, only to be tried and executed in Denmark for murdering a fellow SS officer whom he accused of having an affair with his wife. By early July, the depleted Danes were holding a thin defensive sector between Byakovo and Vasilievshchina. Their task was grim but vital, to help defend the narrow Rambushevo corridor, the only land route linking Demyansk to the main German front. On July 16, 1942, the front was deceptively quiet. Danish soldiers waited for hot food from their field kitchens when, without warning, a tremendous Soviet artillery bombardment ripped across their trenches. For more than an hour, shells tore through the lines, flattening bunkers and turning the forest into fire and splinters. When the barrage lifted, wave after wave of Soviet infantry charged. Dazed but defiant, the Danes fought back. Communication lines were gone. The German unit on their right had vanished, and the Frikorps' flank hung open. Every man who could hold a rifle, cooks, clerks, engineers, even radio operators, was thrown into the fight. Overhead, Stuka dive bombers screamed down to stem the tide. Sørensen's first company once again bore the brunt. By nightfall, only 40 men remained of the original 200. Sørensen radioed Martinsen, "We will hold our ground. We cannot last another assault, but we will not abandon these trenches." That night, an entire Soviet battalion, supported by tanks, struck their line. Fighting degenerated into hand-to-hand slaughter, knives, shovels, grenades, and bare hands in the dark. When the Soviets finally withdrew after midnight, the snow-filled trenches were littered with bodies. The Danes had held, but barely. The next morning, fresh Soviet troops renewed the assault. German reinforcements, 2 Jaeger battalions from Silesia and the 38th Jaeger Regiment, counterattacked along the road to Vasilievshchina but were thrown back with heavy losses. The Soviets followed with another massive assault supported by T-34 tanks and fighter bombers. The Danes, lacking armour or assault guns, fought with their few 50mm anti-tank guns and grenades. Most could do little but crouch in their shattered trenches as shells rained down. Miraculously, after several days of continuous combat, the combined Danish and German defenders managed to stabilise the front. By July 21st, the crisis had passed. The Soviet attack slackened as Stavka shifted attention southward, realizing that the main German summer offensive was aimed not at Moscow, but at the Volga. In the Demyansk forests, silence slowly returned. The Danes, who had entered the pocket as idealists and volunteers, were now hardened veterans. They had lost over 200 men in 6 weeks of fighting, and whatever illusions remained about war. When we first came here, one survivor later said, we still thought about Europe, about ideas. By July, we thought only of firewood, water, and whether the next shell would have our name on it. For the Germans, the Demyansk corridor remained open, a thin scar across the Russian landscape that had cost thousands of lives to hold. The pocket would not be fully evacuated until March 1943, but the battle for its survival had already written itself into legend, a costly success that convinced Hitler the impossible could be done again, and led directly to the tragedy of Stalingrad. By early August 1942, the Frikorps Danmark was barely holding together. Of the original battalion that had entered the Demyansk fighting 3 months earlier, more than 300 Danes were dead. Only about 150 remained at the front, formed into 2 exhausted under-strength companies. The unit was no longer combat effective. The decision was made to withdraw the survivors for rest and refit. Their losses had been devastating. 2 commanders killed in action, countless junior officers and non-commissioned officers lost, and entire platoons wiped out in the frozen forests of Demyansk. Yet their stand had not gone unnoticed. General Walter Graf von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt, commander of 2nd Corps, sent a personal message of thanks. Since the 8th of May, the Denmark Legion has been positioned in the fortress. True to your oath and mindful of the heroic death of your first commander, SS Sturmbannführer Christian von Schalburg, you, the officers and men of the Legion, have shown the greatest bravery and readiness to make sacrifices, as well as exemplary toughness and endurance. Your comrades of the Army and Waffen-SS are proud to fight shoulder to shoulder with you in the truest armed brotherhood. I thank you for your loyalty and courage. The words were respectful, even heartfelt, but they could not mask the reality. The Danish volunteers had been bled white in a battle that few in Denmark would ever understand. At the beginning of August, the survivors were flown out of the salient to Latvia and from there returned home. In Copenhagen, they were greeted with a formal homecoming parade and 3 weeks of leave. For the first time in 3 months, they saw clean streets, civilian faces, and food that was not frozen or rationed. But behind the ceremony lay the stark figures. When the Frikorps had flown into Demyansk on May 8th, it had numbered 24 officers, 80 NCOs, and nearly 600 rank-and-file men. Only 10 officers, 28 NCOs, and 171 men marched in the Copenhagen parade. Some were still lying in hospitals across the Reich, others remained in Russia, buried beneath the forests of Demyansk. The unit had been effectively destroyed. According to German records, the Frikorps was credited with killing more than 1,300 Soviet soldiers, capturing over 100 prisoners, and seizing 600 heavy weapons. The citation, issued in the Totenkopf Division's Order of the Day on August 3, 1942, praised the Danes for their courage and professionalism. For the survivors, the praise meant little. They returned home as broken men, not as heroes. In Copenhagen, as they marched past the crowds, some onlookers jeered and spat. The same countrymen who had cheered them off to war now mocked them for having worn the wrong uniform. The Demyansk campaign left its mark on all who took part. For the Germans, it was proof that an encircled force could survive with air supply, a dangerous illusion that would later feed the tragedy of Stalingrad. For the Danes of Frikorps Danmark, it was the end of innocence. They had entered the war as volunteers for a cause. They left as survivors of a pocket that had consumed nearly all of them. The Demyansk Pocket remained a constant burden for Army Group North. What had once been celebrated as a triumph of endurance soon became a liability, a drain on men, supplies, and morale. By September 1942, Field Marshal Georg von Kuchler, commander of Army Group North, had lost all faith in the value of holding the salient. In a personal letter to the Army High Command dated September 14th, he pleaded for permission to abandon it. The Second Corps, he wrote, had been fighting under appalling conditions since the previous winter. As another Russian winter approached, his troops were exhausted and dangerously under strength. The divisions trapped inside the salient were desperately needed elsewhere to form reserves for both the 16th Army and the Army Group as a whole. A week later, General Franz Halder, the Chief of the General Staff, replied. He acknowledged that abandoning Demyansk would free 12 German divisions, but warned that it would also release 26 Soviet divisions and 7 tank brigades currently tied down around the pocket. His answer, in effect, was meaningless. The decision was not his to make. Hitler's Haltenbefehl, the hold order, remained absolute. Demyansk was to be held at any cost. Throughout the autumn and into the bitter winter of 1942-43, the Russians continued to hammer the narrow corridor linking the pocket to the main German lines. Constant artillery fire, night raids, and partisan attacks turned the area into a frozen wasteland. The pocket's defenders, who had endured isolation the previous winter, now faced the same ordeal again, only this time with fewer supplies and no illusions. By mid-January 1943, the fighting had drained away what little reserves Army Group North still possessed. General Kurt Zeitzler, who had replaced Halder as Chief of Staff, visited Kuchler's headquarters on January 19th. Both men agreed that the Demyansk position was untenable. The Army Group had just suffered a major setback south of Lake Ladoga, and they could no longer afford to keep tens of thousands of men tied down in a static position that offered no strategic benefit. They both knew what had to be done, and they both knew that Hitler would resist it. For days, the issue was debated at Führer headquarters. Then, on the night of January 31st, 1943, the same night the 6th Army capitulated at Stalingrad, Hitler finally relented. Perhaps the disaster on the Volga, or the worsening situation around Leningrad, had forced him to face reality. He agreed to the evacuation of the Demyansk salient. Even then, the order came with hesitation. The High Command informed Kuchler that it had been extremely difficult to secure Hitler's approval, and urged him to act quickly before the decision could be reversed. But a hasty withdrawal risked abandoning vast stockpiles of supplies, vehicles, and artillery that had accumulated in the pocket over the previous 13 months. Kuchler opted instead for a phased retreat, slow, methodical, and carefully timed. On February 20th, 1943, after weeks of preparation, the evacuation began. One by one, the outer positions were pulled back. The last German troops withdrew from Demyansk on March 18th. For the first time in more than a year, the front was straight again. The Demyansk Pocket had cost the Germans over 30,000 casualties and tied down enormous air and ground resources. Yet in the end, it achieved nothing. The ground that had consumed so many lives was quietly abandoned, a frozen graveyard reclaimed by the forest and snow. "We fought there for 13 months, wrote one survivor of the Totenkopf Division. "In the end, we walked away. Nothing remained but the dead." The siege of Demyansk was over, but its shadow remained. A tactical success turned strategic illusion, a costly lesson the German High Command would fail to learn until it was far too late. After a month's leave in Denmark, the Frikorps Danmark returned to the Eastern Front in November 1942. It was initially slated to join the 1st SS Infantry Brigade in Byelarussia, a formation notorious for its brutal anti-partisan operations and reprisals against civilians. But the worsening situation on the front forced a change of plan. Both the brigade and the Frikorps were diverted to the front near the Russian town of Nevel, roughly 250 miles west of Moscow. By the spring of 1943, after months of skirmishes and attritional fighting, the Frikorps had been reduced to barely 630 men. The once proud battalion was withdrawn from the front for reorganization. In the summer of 1943, the remaining Danish volunteers were merged with those serving in the SS Division Viking to form the 24th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment Denmark, part of the new SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland. Their Norwegian counterparts, who had fought with Viking and other units, were gathered into the 23rd SS Panzergrenadier Regiment Norge. The 3rd regiment of this division was Netherlands, composed of Dutch volunteers. The new division Nordland represented the culmination of Himmler's long dream, a Germanic formation made up of Northern European volunteers fighting under the black SS banner. But by then, the tide of war had already turned. At the end of August 1943, most of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, including Nordland, was sent to Croatia to combat Tito's partisans in a brutal counterinsurgency campaign. 4 months later, in December, it was transferred north again, this time to the frozen lines of the Oranienbaum Pocket near Leningrad. From there, the division fought through the long German retreat, first into Estonia, then into Latvia, where it became trapped in the Courland Pocket. In January 1945, the remnants were evacuated by sea to Pomerania, taking part in Operation Sonnenwende the following month, the last failed German attempt to relieve the siege of Kustrin. Already decimated, Division Nordland fell back toward Berlin. By late April, the mixed remnants of Denmark and Norge formed a single battle group, fighting in the streets of the German capital alongside volunteers from across Europe, Frenchmen, Flemings, Estonians, even Spaniards, the dying remnants of the Waffen-SS's multinational dream. They fought to the end in the ruins around the Reich Chancellery and the Tiergarten. Few survived. It is estimated that around 2,000 Danes were killed on the Eastern Front, though the true number may never be known. Norwegian historian Eirik Vuum's research identifies 877 Norwegians killed, including 21 female nurses who served on the front lines. Yet some Danish sources claim far higher figures. A controversial memorial erected in central Jutland between Randers and Viborg claims that as many as 4,000 Danes lost their lives fighting for Germany. When the war ended, Denmark faced a reckoning. The same government that had once permitted Danes to serve in German uniform now turned against them. On June 1st, 1945, 1 month after Germany's surrender, Denmark enacted retroactive laws criminalizing collaboration, including military service for the Reich. Around 3,300 former Danish volunteers were convicted under these laws. Most received sentences of around 2 years in prison. Some returned home quietly. Others faced public humiliation. Many never spoke of Russia again. The men of Frikorps Danmark had survived Demyansk, endured the retreat across the east, and died in the ruins of Berlin, their story forgotten, their motives condemned, their memory divided between shame and tragedy. The Demyansk Pocket was a glimpse of what was to come. Men trapped, starving, frozen, yet refusing to yield. But history rarely speaks their names. Their story was soon drowned out by Stalingrad, the larger, louder tragedy that consumed the world's attention. Yet for those who fought and died in the Demyansk swamps, the suffering was the same. And that brings this video to a close. So if you want more of the untold and overlooked fronts of the war, make sure to like, subscribe. I want to thank you for coming to the end of this video. It's deeply appreciated. I will see you in the next episode. Until then, take care.